Hey, how's it going, everyone? Welcome to my end of the year list 2018. Now, I'll be going over the list of albums that I thought were the best albums of this year. Now, keep in mind that I'm only gonna tell you guys 9 albums, mainly because, well, to be honest with you guys, there weren't that many good albums to come out this year. Of course, we'll be going over what I think are the weakest of the best, and of course, the top best. So, yeah, and I just can't believe we're finally here, guys. We're finally here towards the end of 2018. Yeah, 9 albums. Not as much as my 2017 list, at least I don't think. I think I had more for my 2017 list. But without further ado, we can now get into the list. First up, we got To Drink from the Night Itself by At the Gates. Now, At the Gates is a band that I am fairly new to, and this is basically my first album from them hearing. And I gotta say, I'm pretty pleased. While it's towards the bottom for me, it is an album that I thought was pretty darn good. And the reason that it is more in the bottom for me is because melodic death metal really isn't my thing these days. Like, it's a subgenre that really hasn't held up for me this year like it did last year, but I think this is still a really good album on its own, and I do feel like the songs blended together too easily. However, if you're someone who's sort of missing the 90s and early 2000s melodic death metal, I think you're going to find something that you like about this album. I mean, At the Gates came back at it with a really good album, I think. Next up, we got Rain or Fog by Alice in Chains. Now, I really didn't check out this band until this year, and when I first heard this album, I really didn't know what to think at first, but I can really appreciate what this band does. I think this is still a really good album. I mean, there's a couple songs here and there on this album that really didn't do much for me, but this album still has some great songs on it. If you're an Alice in Chains fan, I'm guessing you have heard this album, but if you haven't, still might want to check it out. Because I think it's definitely a good one. Next up, we got Outsider by 3 Days Grace. Now, 3 Days Grace is a band that I've been a fan of for over 5 years or something like that, and I was really disappointed when I heard that Adam was going to be replaced by Matt in terms of the vocals. And I thought that their last album, Human, was pretty good, but I felt like this album, Outsider, really improved what Human was. I mean, this is definitely Matt Walsh's best vocal delivery, his best vocal performance in 3 Days Grace, by far. Now, when the singles for this album first came out, I wasn't too impressed, but there are some songs that have grown on me, like The Mountain and I Am an Outsider. Those were two singles that I initially just did not care for as much, but they've grown on me quite a bit, I think, and if you're a 3 Days Grace fan for some reason, you just haven't checked out this album yet, you definitely need to do so. And if you're someone who's an Adam Gonte fan, and you haven't been too happy with 3 Days Grace recently, I'd still recommend you give this album a chance, because it might surprise you. Next up, we got Revival by Light the Torch. Now, again, a new band to me, and they're actually a new band in general. They're a band that is from the 2010s, if I'm not mistaken. And a lot of you guys may know how I feel about bands who formed after the 2010s or like during the 2010s. However, when I listened to this album, it honestly surprised me. Now, Light the Torch, I'm not too familiar with them, so, don't quote me on anything, but I do believe that Howard Jones is the vocalist of this band now. I don't know if he was the vocalist of the other albums, but I do know that he was the vocalist for Revival. And I gotta say, if you're a Howard Jones fan or someone who's a fan of old school Killswitch Engage, I think you're gonna really like this album, because, I mean, Howard Jones, I think, really gave it his all best on this album. Next album up, we got Automata by Between the Buried and Me. Now, Between the Buried and Me is a band that I've been a fan of for quite a few years now, and when this album was coming out, I was actually pretty excited for it. I wasn't too impressed with the first single that they came out with, but over time it did grow on me, and I really like a lot of the songs from this album. And there is actually 2 parts that released this year. I prefer the first part, honestly, and I feel like I'm one of the few people who do prefer the first part, because I do feel like the majority of fans prefer the second part. The song Blot from this album was a song that I did return to a lot, and I think it's one of Between the Buried and Me's best songs to date. And yeah, I definitely enjoyed this album for what it was. I mean, Between the Buried and Me, I would say, kind of went back to their roots, and it's really surprising how overlooked this album is, and how people say that this is one of their weakest. But I felt like this album really reflected back on their Great Misdirect and Colors days. And if you're someone who's interested in giving Between the Buried and Me a try, I definitely recommend you check out this album. This is an album that I would show people who haven't heard the band before. I think Between the Buried and Me put out a really good album. Whew, well, this one's gonna hurt since I don't have this one in the top 3. But next up, I got Ember by Breaking Benjamin. Breaking Benjamin was one of the first bands that I ever gotten into, and I've been a fan of them for as long as I can remember. This feels like one of those bands that I grew up with, and maybe because they are. I mean, I've been a fan of these guys for longer than most bands. I think I've been a fan of them longer than any band I'm into nowadays. And a lot of you know about the hiatus they've been on, and then they returned with Dark Before Dawn, which I thought was a pretty good comeback album, but I felt like with Ember, they really improved since Dark Before Dawn. They brought back some of the aggression, the heaviness, and just the melodies overall, I think, were really good. Now, there are still some problems that I do have with this album. For one, I felt like it was a very short album. It could have been longer. And they released way too many singles before the album actually came out. But there are some songs that I do still like coming back to, like Feed the Wolf, Red Cold River, and Psycho are songs that are just really good in my opinion. And some of the best tracks on the album, in my opinion. If you're someone who used to be a Breaking Benjamin fan, but you just felt like they're missing the aggression and the heaviness that were in previous albums like Saturate, I think you should definitely give this album a try. I do like Ember, though. I think it's a great album. It's not, I wouldn't say it's one of my favorite Breaking Benjamin albums, but it isn't really one of my least favorites either. It's more in the middle for me when it comes to their discography. I thought for sure that this album would be closer to the number 2 spot towards the end of the year, but unfortunately the replay value just wasn't all there. But I do like this album. This is a really good album from Breaking Benjamin, and I highly recommend you check it out if you're any kind of fan of hard rock or alternative metal. Now, I apologize if you can't see the album cover on my screen, but this album cover is really bright, so yeah. But next up, we got Firepower by Judas Priest. Now, Judas Priest is a band that I am sort of new to. I've only been a fan of them for almost a year or something like that. Actually, I think I've been a fan of them for like a year now, and I gotta say, I've been so impressed from what I've been hearing by them. And when I heard this album was coming out, and when I heard people just praising this album, I was like, yeah, I'll give it a try. And I can see what all the hype was about, because for the longest time, Firepower was actually my favorite album of this year, just until the fall hit. Like, it's an album that's held up for me a lot this year. There's a lot of songs on this album that I have just kept coming back to, and for good reason. This album has so much replay value, and it's just amazing to me how a band from the 70s can still make great music today. I mean, just a fantastic album overall, and if you're a Judas Priest fan, for some reason you passed up this album, definitely check it out. So I definitely recommend you check out this album if you're looking for an album that came out this year, or if you're someone who's just looking for a really good metal album to listen to. I highly recommend Firepower by Judas Priest. Next album up, we got All I See Is War by Sevendust. This is the first album that I ever heard from Sevendust, and The first time I listened to it, I loved it. I loved it since first listen. It was an album that, when I first listened to it, I thought, I have to go out and buy this album, and that's exactly what I did. Now, a lot of you guys know that modern hard rock was something that hasn't really just been doing it for me as of recently, but I'm really glad that I did give this album a try, because this band, or in this album especially, is more like hard rock, alternative metal type stuff, and I felt like the thing is with Sevendust is, you know, they have a lot of aggression, but they also can be very melodic in their songs, and I think this album has a ton of replay value. So if you're someone like me who's kind of think hard rock really isn't at its peak anymore, or like not really as good, or not in its prime anymore, I definitely recommend you give this album a try, because this album sure surprised me, and my first listen, I loved it ever since, and I'm definitely a Sevendust fan now, and I look forward to checking out their previous albums. I'm not sure how many of you guys would be surprised at this one, but at number 1, I got Victim of the New Disease by All That Remains. Now, this is insane. Why do I say it's insane? Because last year, their last album, Madness, didn't even make it on my end of the year list. And then, not even 2 years later, their next album made it to be number 1. How that happened, I have no idea. But let me tell you, it really, really shows Phil Labonte and all those guys. They really looked over, you know, what went wrong with Madness, I believe, and they thought that, you know what, we need to go back to the roots. And they sure did. Now, this isn't a complete return to the roots, of course, because I don't believe there's any band in the world that can completely go back to the roots. You know, but they do it enough so that it's pleasing to everyone. And I gotta say this. Victim of the New Disease feels like an album for the fans. Whether you're a fan of All That Remains old stuff, whether you're a fan of their new stuff, I think this album has something that you are going to like. And I gotta say, I am very, very pleased with this album. And I definitely recommend you give it a listen. And if you're someone who, I guess, kind of slipped away or backslid from metalcore for a bit, I definitely recommend you give this album a chance. And if you're someone who was disappointed in Madness and has no desire to check out this album, let me tell you, you're really going to do yourself a favor by checking out this album, because I'll also admit Madness was a big disappointment to me. And Ollie Herbert, a lot of you know, he sadly passed away, rest in peace, and I have to say that he really did a great job with the guitar work on this album. I mean, it's really just a phenomenal album, and you know, when they released the first singles for this album, the first 3 singles, I knew right away that this album was going to be at least within the top 3 best albums of the year, in my opinion. I loved every single that they came out with prior to this album, and I can really see myself coming back to this album a lot. So I had to put it at number 1 because it's just that good of an album. And this might even be within the top 3 best All That Remains albums. I mean, it's definitely their best album since either Overcome or For We Are Many. But Victim of the New Disease is a fantastic album, and I highly recommend you check it out. Okay, you guys, that just about wraps up this list of my 2018 album list. I'd like to hear your thoughts. What are some albums that you thought were the best of this year? And what do you guys think of my list? Like and subscribe. Let me know what you guys think of my list, of course. And thank you for watching. Have a good one. Take care.